Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.
To share this webinar with you and to add one additional point to the introduction that respected Ali has given of my bio. In addition to all of the work I've done in Canada, I've increasingly been doing work in the Middle East and in the Muslim world. I've lectured in over 40 countries to talk about global competitiveness, and I have most recently been working with many companies, helping them deploy global strategies. So what I'm going to talk about over the next 40 minutes are the pitfalls involved in deploying a global strategy. So in 2005, Thomas Friedman wrote a book, and the title of which was "The World is Flat." The idea being that with the internet and all of the innovations in communications technology, with governments reducing barriers to international trade and foreign investment and to doing business internationally, the idea was that the borders, all of the frictions associated with doing business internationally have come down dramatically, and that was the thesis of Thomas Friedman. And of course, if Thomas Friedman were correct and the world was flat, then it would be quite simple to deploy a global strategy. It would simply require the application of a domestic strategy to a bigger market. Companies that were successful in any given country would simply do the same thing as they moved into other markets internationally. And we know that won't work. There's tremendous evidence to show the world is not flat. I could spend an entire hour reviewing that evidence. I'll focus on a little bit today, but there are significant costs to doing business internationally, and I start with a very, very timely case study. Target, one of the largest retailers in the United States, very, very successful company with tens of billions of dollars of revenue annually, moved into the Canadian market just 2 years ago. And after 2 years of operating in the Canadian market, it's actually leaving. It's filing for bankruptcy in the Canadian space. And what you can't think of two markets that are more similar. You look at Canada and the United States, very, very much integrated in terms of trade and investment and immigration flows. We have a free trade agreement, similar culture and similar language. We're adjacent to one another with transportation infrastructures, making it very, very easy to cross international borders. And despite all of these similarities, Target, as it moved into the Canadian market, expecting to really mix up or shake up the Canadian retail landscape, totally failed. And if you look at the bar graph on the right of this slide, you can see how the per store sales per day, and the light blue are the sales in Canada, the dark blue are the sales in the US, so these are sales by store by day. And you can see in 2003, the Canadian stores did not do nearly as well as they expected, and in 2014, it got even worse. So the headlines in Canada, in the international media, in the Globe and Mail, in Bloomberg, in the Financial Times, Target leaving Canada, losing money every single day. Here's one commentator commenting on Bloomberg News about the tremendous failure of this global expansion. Target did not really understand the Canadian market. Target assumed it was the same as the U.S., meaning Canada was the same as the U.S. Target misunderstood the Canadian landscape. This Target fiasco is a huge blunder. It highlights the difficulties in global expansion, even when that global expansion goes to close and very familiar markets, in this case an American multinational moving into the Canadian market. So global expansion very often delivers what's less than expected, and the question is why? Why did Target fail in the Canadian space? And everyone on this call should be able to give me the answer to that question, and the answer is Target assumed the world is flat, and it clearly is not. So there are lots and lots of examples that we can go through that are quite similar Here are just four. I would assume everyone on the call is familiar with all four of these brands. Mattel opens up a massive operation in China trying to roll out its Barbie doll. The Barbie doll is one of the most successful toys internationally. After just 2 years of operating in China, they had to close down, massive losses and withdraw from the Chinese market. And the reason given for that is that while Barbie is very, very well recognized in the Western markets, in China, Barbie is not a well-known commodity. So in trying to roll out this product that is well-known in the home market in the United States, fell on deaf ears in China. McDonald's, it's hard to imagine a McDonald's not being successful no matter where you put it, but McDonald's opened in the Caribbean, and after just 1 year in Barbados, it withdrew. It did very, very badly in Jamaica, and it really did not understand the operating environment. The barriers to operating a fast food chain in the Caribbean are quite difficult, and because they did not understand that, on the operating side, they experienced many, many difficulties, but also on the revenue side. The spending power, the income per capita, wasn't sufficient to support the kinds of revenue that a McDonald's franchise would require to be sustainable, and McDonald's had to withdraw. And on the bottom right, Starbucks, you know, one of the global giants, expanding internationally in the Middle East as well as in the Muslim world. But as they went into Australia, thinking, wow, Australia, like Canada, is very, very similar to the United States. How can we not be successful in Australia, was the view of senior management at Starbucks. As they moved into the Australian market, they quickly came to realize that they were not able to compete with local coffee shops, and also there was a bit of a backlash where people in Australia did not see the differentiation that Starbucks was offering to justify the premium that they required to buy their coffee. So did very, very poorly and withdrew many, many of their franchises from that market. So here are four giant brands from the United States, some of the most successful companies internationally, and their global expansions failed simply because they did not do their due diligence. So just to step back and to say, okay, what does all of this mean? Well, let's look at the United States. No other country in the world has a larger footprint in terms of multinational business activity than the United States. And this first bar graph shows what the GDP shares are of the three major regions of the world. North America is about 26% of the world economy, Europe's about 24%, and Asia's about 20%. So if the world were flat, if there were few barriers to doing business internationally, one would expect that sales of U.S. multinationals, so all of these big U.S. companies, one would expect their sales internationally to reflect these GDP shares. But of course, when you look at sales of U.S. multinationals, despite North America only being about 26% of the world economy, a full 75% of sales of U.S. multinationals are in North America, only 15% in Europe, and 6% in Asia, and you get very similar numbers when you look at assets or employment. Now this slide, while it does look at U.S. multinational activity, if I were to do the same slide for Asian multinationals or European multinationals, the figure would look very much the same. All of this says is there's a significant home bias. Multinationals concentrate their activities near their home market simply because there are significant obstacles to doing business internationally. And the further away from your home market you go, the higher and higher those costs become. This is not to say the cost to going to close markets is insignificant, as the Target example I just demonstrated a minute ago demonstrates clearly. When Target came into Canada, you can think of no two markets that are more integrated or similar in terms of culture and language. This is a slide, this one's a little bit tough, but the United States is about $16.7 trillion economy, so about $17 trillion economy. Canada is about a $1.9 trillion economy, and Mexico is about 1.4 trillion. So the United States is 16.7 trillion. Let's look at Europe. Europe's about $12.7 trillion. Now one would expect then that the United States, this $17 trillion economy, would trade more with Europe than it would with Canada or Mexico. After all, Europe is 6 or 7 times larger than Canada or Mexico. So let's look at the data. Now this next slide, again, it's a complicated one, but let's look at the country of France, and you can see the number 1216. What does that mean? That means that if I take all of the countries in Europe and add up their GDP, their economies, the size of their economies, you can see that France is about 16% of all of Europe's economy. Similar to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is the same size as France economically, and they each comprise about 16% of European GDP. But if you look at all U.S. trade, look at trade between the United States and all of Europe, what you see is that France, despite being about 16% of European GDP, only receives 12% of U.S. trade with Europe. In sharp contrast, the United Kingdom receives 20% of U.S. trade with Europe. So despite the United Kingdom and France being the same size, both in Europe, France only gets 12% of U.S. trade with Europe, whereas the United Kingdom gets 20%. That's an interesting observation. So the obvious question to ask is why? What's so different about France and the United Kingdom that helps explain why the United Kingdom gets so much more of U.S. trade than does France? After all, these countries are the same size. They're both in Europe. They're about the same distance roughly from the United States. They're in a similar time zone. So what could help explain why the United Kingdom gets so much more trade? And again, this is going to speak directly to the cost of global expansion. And two answers will immediately jump to everyone's mind. The one obvious answer is English. The United Kingdom has English as an official language. France does not. And so therefore, because the United Kingdom has English, the cost of doing business with the United States is significantly lower. France does not have English as an official language, and therefore costs are higher. And that's one explanation for why the United Kingdom gets more trade or more business with the United States. It's this common language. With common language comes common culture, but of course historically rooted is the fact that the United States is a former British colony. And so we know colonial ties really, really matter. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this picture and I'm going to superimpose Canada and Mexico on this picture. Now Canada and Mexico are not in Europe. Obviously they're in North America. But let's just look at what happens. Mexico is about 5% the size of Europe. Canada is about 7 or 8% the size of Europe. Even though Canada and Mexico are so small relative to Europe, Mexico receives 60% the amount of trade that the U.S. does with all of Europe. The Canada one is absolutely phenomenal. Everyone on this phone should look at that and say, wow, the United States trades more with Canada than it does with all of Europe. Despite Europe being a $14 trillion economy and Canada being less than $2 trillion, the United States trades more with Canada than it does with all of Europe, and the United States trades with Mexico is 60% its trade with all of Europe. So the obvious question becomes, why is that the case? And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first is Canada and Mexico are very close to the United States. They're adjacent. They're immediately next door. Secondly, there's a free trade agreement which allows for the free flow of goods and services across borders. Right? But the next question to ask is, why does Canada get almost twice the amount of U.S. trade that Mexico does? And the two answers that immediately jump to to the fore is, number one, Canada and the United States share English as a common language, and with that comes lots of cultural similarities, as well as the fact that Canada and the United States have a common colonizer, which is the UK. All of these historical ties and these links help explain why countries trade more with one another, why expansion of international business across these kinds of markets tend to be more successful. Now, this article from the Financial Times highlights an article that I wrote with my graduate student who's now at Harvard Business School, and talks about the importance of English as a lingua franca, as the language of international business. And as it turns out, when two countries do business with one another, when one country enters another market, if those two countries share a common language, that goes a long way to making it much, much easier to do business internationally and therefore to be successful. What this paper shows is that if you look at the 7 common languages among developed countries, the most important language is English. What that means is that among developed countries, multinationals that deploy English within their global strategy are much, much more successful than companies that deploy French or Italian or Spanish or German. I'm working on an extension. I'm not there yet, so I can't talk about those results, but integrating Arabic and Urdu and Mandarin into that analysis, but I'm not there yet. I'm working on that currently. I'm working closely right now with a bank, and for those people on the phone that are thinking about doing international expansion, especially to markets that are quite unfamiliar, this is a case study I strongly encourage you to think hard about. The Industrial Commercial Bank of China, I work very, very closely with this bank. It's got 420,000 employees. They're expanding internationally at a rapid rate, and they've taken the right approach to global expansion. What they've done is they take about 20 executives, and they send these executives to one of 4 countries, so Canada, the United States, France, and Australia. And these executives stay in these countries for an entire year, all paid for by the bank. And the reason they do this is they want their executives to better understand English, so they know English prior to arriving, but they further develop their English skills. But in addition to that, they're able to develop their soft skills. Many people in business underestimate the importance of soft skills, especially in negotiating and interacting with others, but business culture and Western culture. And what basically the ICBC has done, the Industrial Commercial Bank of China, has invested in creating a depth of skills within its labor force, very, very expensive, but that will help this bank enter foreign markets. And increasingly, the ICBC is expanding internationally, not just in Western markets, but also into the Muslim world as well. Just a quick point on which languages could potentially eclipse English. And you know, Professor Crystal from the UK, one of the foremost experts on language, argues there's nothing inherently special about English. Why did English become the lingua franca, sort of the international language? It just turned out to be the case that when we had a surge in globalization, English-speaking countries were sort of the world leaders economically, so the United States and the UK. But Professor Crystal was asked which languages he thinks could potentially overtake English as the world's lingua franca, or the language of business. And he said it would be Chinese, meaning Mandarin, Spanish, or Arabic, which is quite interesting. So what are the costs of doing business internationally? As companies expand internationally, very, very often they do not do their due diligence. They think simply because they're very successful in their home market, they're able to deploy these global strategies. They're able to go into another market thinking the world is flat and replicate what they do in their domestic market internationally. And of course, as we've shown above, that's not the case. Distance is very important. Crossing borders is very, very important. culture, language, and religious differences. I should underline religious differences, especially in the current environment. Religious differences are quite important, especially for companies that may come out of the Muslim world. Time zones matter extensively. Many people underestimate the cost associated with doing webinars or conference calls. When you have your senior management team spread over many, many time zones, it becomes not just quite expensive, but very disruptive to one's career when they have to be up in the middle of the night to take a conference call. Managing exchange rate risks are quite important. So if you think about countries within the GCC, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and so on, what's interesting is that there's almost a fixed exchange rate regime within the GCC. Kuwait's on a basket peg, but vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar. So doing business within that network of countries really mitigates the exchange rate risks. And also going into for example, China or other countries that have a fixed exchange rate with the U.S., the exchange rate risks are mitigated, but nevertheless, one needs to manage those. Compliance with local institutions and regulatory requirements. The McDonald's example I gave you about going into the Caribbean is a great example, but especially in healthcare, the delivery of healthcare, approval for pharma drugs and so on, and regulatory. Lots of evidence to show that companies need to, as they move into foreign markets, they need to raise capital in those local markets. It becomes quite difficult. So distance, broadly defined, must be well understood and compensated for whenever a company deploys a global strategy. Otherwise, it will be a major impediment to global success. And these are not just physical differences. These also include cultural differences, religious differences, and political differences. And we've already talked a bit about colonial ties, but colonial ties really help mitigate these four. Countries that have had a colonial heritage tend to have cultural similarities and so on. Just a quick example, a couple of examples of other takeovers from the developing world into the emerging markets. So the examples I've done so far have been American, but think about Dubai ports. Dubai ports wants to come into the United States and take over some ports in the U.S. in a highly charged environment. Big political backlash. Clearly, the people that led this potential takeover did not do their due diligence. Having a company from the Arab world controlling ports into the U.S., it should have been quite clear that there would have been this political backlash, and this again created quite a sensation in North America, but also in the Middle East around potential frictions, cultural frictions and political frictions between the Arab world. And you have to remember, this is despite the fact that the UAE, together with Saudi Arabia, are two of America's closest allies in the Middle East. Despite that, there was still this political backlash over this potential. Here's another example, CNOOC. CNOOC is a state-owned company in China. It moves into the Canadian market to buy a Canadian asset. Tremendous pushback. In the end, really hurt economic relations between Canada and China. And here's another example, Najib Sawiris from Egypt invested in Canada, and I put the link there. I encourage you to watch that video. It's incredible. It's so insightful. But Najib Sawiris talks about how his company does business in 40 countries around the world, but despite that, coming into the Canadian market, he found tremendous amount of pushback from the incumbent telecom companies that tried to prevent him from doing well in the Canadian market. And this last one here, that's a picture of me there at the bottom, but I started a course here at the Rotman School. It's in Islamic finance. It's the 4th year of the course. The growth in demand for the course is quite remarkable. This year, we've had the largest enrollment ever. We've had a huge waiting list where people want to take the course, but there isn't room. We thought about opening up another section, but decided not to. But within Canada, there's a big push by banks from the GCC and Asia. In fact, I have a meeting tomorrow with the bank from Asia about moving into the Canadian market. And so the whole question becomes economically, politically, regulatory, what are the obstacles to doing this kind of banking in Canada? And again, what we're trying to do is to do our due diligence to really understand the Canadian landscape before Islamic banking and other Islamic businesses move into the Canadian market. We want to make sure that we do this one right, and this is a tremendous opportunity for Islamic banks to come into Canada. So knowing where the opportunities are. So there's 200 plus countries in the world. If you represent an organization and you're wondering where on earth should we go, what market should we move into, how do we prioritize our markets? So managers tend to focus on markets that are close, that have a similar culture, that have a similar language. One cannot underestimate the importance of networks and family. There's a tremendous amount of evidence to show that networks, family, immigrants across countries have a huge predictive content for where international business will take place. And also people tend to look at big markets. So basically most managers use these 5 factors in identifying what markets they should go into, and that results in many missed opportunities. Here's 2 links. One, it's an interview with the CEO of Pepsi. The second is an interview with the CEO of McKinsey, talking about how many multinationals, much of the discourse on multinational global expansion really focuses in on the BRIC markets, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. But in fact, there's lots and lots of markets, and the McKinsey CEO highlights 2 in particular. He talks about Indonesia and Nigeria as 2 markets that are growing incredibly quickly, doing very, very well, and these are markets that very, very often are missed by senior managers in organizations. So why do managers deploy a global strategy? So if you're ever in a senior meeting in your organization and there's a discussion about moving into a foreign market, the very first question that one should articulate is why? Why does your company want to deploy a global strategy? What is the reason? What is the motivation? And in my academic opinion, in my experience, if you don't have the right answer for that question, then you should not deploy a global strategy. So if the C-level are giving answers like bigger is better, or we need to have a global footprint, or our competitors are there, so therefore we should go there, these are all incorrect reasons. That's not the reason to deploy a global strategy. So companies routinely exaggerate the attractiveness of foreign markets. They underestimate the cost, and these errors lead to very, very expensive mistakes, such as the ones I've talked about already. Follow the leader is one of the most articulated reasons why C-level executives argue for moving into other markets. If other firms are in the industry enter a new market, then I better be there too. We better follow the leader. What's a good strategy for one company may not be a good strategy for another, and there's not enough attention given to why companies are successful. So Pankaj Ghemawat, the youngest full professor ever at Harvard University, developed this what we call CAGE framework, and this is sort of a paradigm or a model that you can use to look at your global expansion. And he writes, that analysts and the media often pay too little attention to what really created economic value. In other words, why are companies successful? And here, this is sort of an academic point, but correlation is not the same as causation. Simply because the world's most successful companies are international, it does not mean their success comes from that international expansion. Companies are not successful because they're international. The evidence shows very, very clearly that companies that are international were successful to begin with. That is so important, it deserves to be said again. The world's most successful companies are successful not because they're international. They're international because they're successful. So those companies that are doing very, very well in their domestic markets that then try to roll out a global strategy in order to replicate this success internationally. So here is the empirical evidence. You can see the least productive firms, the most productive firms on the far right, and the intermediate productive firms in the middle. And the evidence shows very strongly that only the most productive firms, so it's only those most successful firms that engage in foreign direct investment, that engage in global expansion. The firms that have an intermediate level of productivity are the firms that engage in international trade, and the least productive firms are the ones that operate only domestically. And we have many case studies to show the companies on the far left that are the least productive that think about moving into the global economy to somehow enhance their productivity, and that is completely disastrous. So before companies want to deploy a global strategy, they need to better understand where they sit on this continuum of productivity. Just a quick point about the Islamic world, the Organization of Islamic Countries. What's quite interesting is that the Muslim population in the world is about 20%. So the 57 member countries as well as Muslims in the West, you add all of them up, there's about 20% of the global population that is Muslim. Despite being 1/5 of the world's population, only 1/10 of the world's GDP is from Muslim countries. So that means that on average Muslims have an income per capita that's 1/2 the global average. So you might expect that, given we're about 20% of the world population, one might expect that out of the Fortune 500, the world's 500 largest companies, one might expect that 20% of those companies might be from the Muslim world. As it turns out, of the Fortune 500 companies, what percent of them come from the Muslim world? And the answer is, and I want everyone just to think for a second, despite being 20% of the world's population, 10% of the world's economy, of the Fortune 500 companies, how many come from the Muslim world? The answer is 3. That's a very small number and deserves it deserves a whole hour in and of itself, but very so from the OIC, and the answer is just 3, Petronas, SABIC, and KOC, Kuwait Oil Company, this deserves a whole seminar in itself, and the work done by Dinar Standard they must be commended for all of the work that they do. It's absolutely fantastic. But again, you think about culturally from the Muslim world, the research done by Dinar Standard highlights 3 factors that could help explain why companies from the Muslim world may not have as big a global footprint as one might expect. Corporate culture that discourages fear of culture. So this whole thing around driving innovation, creating competitiveness, big thinking, and a corporate culture that encourages critical thinking. But these are factors culturally that we need to think much more about, because companies from the Muslim world that emanate or come from these environments could be so much more successful if they were able to create that culture of innovation, of creativity, of critical thinking that then allows for companies to have the kinds of products and services and intellectual property, medical devices, healthcare, financial services that are saleable globally and are differentiated. So firms that are global are highly productive, not because they are global. These companies are global because they are highly productive, and thinking about the Muslim world, thinking about the country or the environments that you operate in, having an environment that is very creative, that is very innovative, where new products are emanating, where there's intellectual property being developed, that will allow companies to emerge that are highly productive, that are highly created, producing differentiated products. And these are the companies that are able to have accessible footprint. Even the large organizations are able to tap into these innovations and help them deploy these global strategies. So deploying global strategies is very, very difficult. Firms must be productive to succeed. If a firm is not doing well domestically, then how can it possibly do well in a foreign market? But when firms are doing well domestically, the global opportunities are immense, and global strategy must be executed carefully. So companies that are doing very, very well domestically, there is just incredible opportunity in the global economy. So once a firm does decide to go global, the question is, how do they do it? How do you deploy that global strategy? And here's a continuum. So this first slide on the left, these are modes related to exporting, and they go from the lowest commitment to the highest commitment. And the first thing is just don't do it. Second is sell to a home country exporting agent or foreign company importing agent. Third is contract with a foreign country importing agent. Or fourth, establish a foreign subsidiary that imports. So these are all associated with exporting. Different levels of commitment, but the first mode towards global expansion is simply exporting. And this is very important because this is what companies tend to do rather than go full out and try to commit to a foreign market, especially when it requires significant capital investment. However, once the due diligence is done and companies begin to think more about increasing their footprint internationally, they can now think about having a foreign presence, and again, going to a higher commitment. So moving from those exporting modes that I had on the previous slide, now we can think about actually moving production to the foreign market. So licensing production to a foreign manufacturer who distributes, establish a foreign subsidiary either via acquisition or greenfield investment. The acquisition versus greenfield. So greenfield would mean just opening up sort of an entirely new facility versus acquisition. Acquisition is quite important, similarly with mergers, especially when you're going into a new market with brand association or familiarity with the brand. By acquiring a local firm, you're able to buy that company's reputation, buy their brand, buy the familiarity, but also their networks into the local market. But again, once you move into the foreign market with a foreign presence, that represents a significantly higher commitment. Okay, so I'm just going to jump forward with these, and I'm just going to go to few companies can afford to enter all markets. There's very, very few companies, so we could go on around everyone on this call, and I'm sure you can list 20 companies that have a global presence, but not very many companies. It's a select group that are able to deploy these global strategies. So the reality check, the track record shows picking the most attractive foreign market, determining the best time to enter, selecting the right partners and the right levels of commitment or investment has proven to be difficult for many, many companies, especially when it involves moving into large emerging markets like China or India or Brazil. It takes substantial time and resources to establish a global presence. McCain Foods, the world's largest producer of frozen vegetables, has moved into the Indian market. What I find fascinating about that case study is that now McCain Foods, a Western multinational, is now competing with Indian producers to sell products that have Indian recipes. It's absolutely remarkable, quite a success story. But they spent an entire 10 years before they actually moved into to the Indian market. So many firms therefore prefer expansion to minimize capital, but I encourage everyone on the phone, before deploying a global strategy, you must separate what we call the must-be-in markets from the nice-to-be-in markets. It's very, very important so that precious resources are not wasted with global expansions that ex post turn out to have been ill-advised. And with that, I will stop and turn the microphone back to respected Brother Ali to field any questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hejazi, for a very interesting presentation, full of slides with lots of stats and illustrations. Folks, we are open for question and answers. If you have any questions, you can put it in the question box, or you could raise your hand. There's a hand icon available on the webinar console, on the right side of your screen. So if you click on it, I shall give you an opportunity to speak to Dr. Hejazi. Let me go straight to the question box. There's a question on global expansion. What should be the approach in seeking advice and assistance from any international trade associations or body before moving ahead?
That's a fantastic question, and it's very important to reach out to organizations in the foreign market that you would like to move into. But whoever asked that question, I encourage you strongly to watch the video for Wind Mobile, Najib Sawiris. I put the link in the slides, and I'll go to that now. The reason I bring up that example, there it is there. The reason I bring up that example is Najib Sawiris consulted extensively with organizations in Canada that really misrepresented how welcome his investment, his move into the Canadian economy would be. And so why that's important is that you must do your due diligence. You must understand what the motivation is for the organization you're speaking to. So if you talk to trade associations or government officials or trade commissioners for any country, they're going to tell you that you're very much welcome to try to bring you into the market, but you must be much more critical to find out how companies that have gone before you were welcomed in that foreign market and what the obstacles are. You should be able to write down, in order of importance, the obstacles to moving into a foreign market. Even if it's a market right next door to you, if that list is very short, then you have missed something. So I advise you to speak to these trade associations and trade commissioners, but you will not get an unbiased view. You should seek advice from other companies that have moved into there, or look at the case studies, or talk to people like me. Thank you.
Okay, we are here to listen to you today. So let's move to another question from Mr. Mark Storer. The question is, what is a good way to understand what is a good to be in market as opposed to must be in market?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So, you know, again, we'd have to think very carefully about the kind of product or the industry that you're operating in. So just, you know, for the sake of this conversation, because it will depend, but imagine if you're in consumer products. If you think about consumer products, you think about the high growth markets. So we know that the Europe, North America, and Japan are very rich markets, but they're low growth. Whereas the emerging markets of Asia and the Middle East are high growth markets. So the first thing is you want to go through this checklist of the indicators, but one needs to look at what the objective of the organization is. And if one of the objectives of the organization is to grow sales, then a must-be market would be a market that has three characteristics. The one characteristic is it has to be high growth. If it's not a high growth market, then you have to think really hard. Secondly, it has to have the kind of income that would support the product that you're selling. What we saw with McDonald's when it went into the Caribbean is that the incomes in the Caribbean were not sufficient to support that kind of a lifestyle. But the third one is your investment welcome? So what is the competitive landscape in that market? So the worst way to think about a market as a must-be in is because your competitors are there. It goes back to the statement that correlation is not causation. Simply because your competitors are there does not make it a must-be-in market. The must-be-in markets must be aligned with the objectives of the company. And when you think of the objectives of the company, then you look at all of the markets, and then again, this is more complicated than it may appear. You then have to look at these are the markets we have to be in. It has to be a market where the income is sufficiently high to support your product. Secondly, the product that you're selling is popular in that market. When Mattel went into China trying to sell the Barbie doll, thinking, wow, the Barbie doll is one of the most popular toys in the West, but the people in China, it wasn't top of mind. So the idea then, it depends on, the short answer is it depends on the objectives of the organization and whether or not the market that you consider can achieve that. So then you would prioritize the markets, and then by looking at the cost of that global expansion, we'll then separate that short list into the ones that should be a go and the ones that should not be a go. And I hope I've been able to shed light on that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have similar sort of supplementary questions. What particular researches or checklists one should conduct or prepare to assess potential changes to set expectations and avoid surprises?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best, that's a fantastic question. And there's this, this cliche that history often repeats itself. So the number one exercise that must be done before going into a market, the issue of seeking guarantees from government is not sufficient. Because very often, once you move into a market, things happen. There's domestic lobbies, especially if you're shaking up the domestic industry. Again, Najib Sawiris came into the Canadian market. There are 3 incumbents that are very, very profitable in the telecom sector. He received assurances from the Canadian government. The big 3 really lobbied against allowing Wind Mobile or Rascom to do well in the Canadian market, and he found it very, very difficult. So I think the number one piece of research, and it's country specific, is what is the history? Again, the cliche, history repeats itself. What is the government or the country's reputation in terms of how it treats foreign companies? And if that's been hostile and if that has changed time and time again, then one needs to be very, very careful. But having said that, there's a company called BHP Billiton that tried to do a $40 billion takeover of a potash asset, and I would parallel, and that's from one friendly country to another, and I parallel that to Dubai Ports trying to buy ports in the United States. One needs to get a PR. If it's a high-profile investment, if it's under the radar, it doesn't matter as much. But if it's a high-profile investment, to get a PR firm that understands the local market to really advise you on where the potential mines are, so that when you move in, where are the potential obstacles to the strategy that you've developed for your rollout of your global expansion. You cannot understand that simply by doing your research. You need to speak to or understand the companies that have gone before you, but get a company like a PR firm or a consulting firm that actually understands that market and has helped other companies move into that market to really understand what the reputation and the history has been of governments and local industry of responding to entrants from other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have one last question. How should one make up his or her mind and choose one's global primary headquarters location based on the needs of the business to flourish?
Yeah, that's another fantastic question, and there's a big discussion in the academic arena as well as the international policy arena, and this will also come up in Davos when the world's 1% meets in the coming weeks. Where should the global headquarters be for any particular company? And very often you think of the headquarters locating in the home country where that company is domiciled. And the reason for that is all of the board members, the key players, the key networks are in that home country. And that's very important. Thinking about the theme, or one of the things that we've talked about in this webinar, is that a company needs to be successful domestically before really thinking about a global expansion. So all of your networks, all of your linkages, all of the people that have been involved in your success tend to be in your home country, and that's why one needs to think about the head office being in the home country, where all of that activity, all of that network, all of the successes have helped you do so well. It'd be very, very difficult to move your headquarters to another market, but as your footprint internationally moves, one might think about moving their headquarters, but that's quite rare to happen. Having said that, increasingly what we're seeing are companies moving their head offices for tax purposes, which in and of itself deserves another webinar, but the idea about international tax structures and offshore financial centers, and the fact that companies like Apple and Google and Starbucks are able to incorporate in these offshore centers to reduce their global tax liabilities. That's a phenomenon that is very important and also impacts the location of headquarters. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Hejazi, and folks, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. But before we conclude, let me quickly share what I'm illustrating on the screen right now. Dr. Hejazi, I've taken the liberty to share my screen just to illustrate our upcoming program for Advanced Leadership and Management that is scheduled to commence on April 17th, which will last for 2 weeks till April 30th in Madinah, Saudi Arabia. And you'll have a chance to meet Dr. Hejazi in person, who's also coming, and he will be a part of the PALM program, delivering a workshop. So I highly recommend to please visit palm.mile.org and explore it and try to enroll yourself as an early bird. Thank you very much. And Dr. Hejazi, any concluding remarks that you would like to give before we dismiss out?
I just like to say I'm very impressed with the questions that were asked. I look forward to seeing you all in Medina, where we can interact face-to-face and carry these discussions, to have a much more in-depth discussion, not just in class, but afterwards, inshallah. Thank you.
Inshallah, and thank you very much, and thank you all of those who participated in this webinar. We are recording it. It will be uploaded, and you can download the soft copy of the presentation from the community. The link was already pasted in the chat console, or you can just visit community.mile.org, visit the download sections. Under the strategy category, you can download today's presentation. So once again, thank you very much. You all have a good day, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're calling from. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Madinah Institute for Leadership and Entrepreneurship, MILE.